You're listening to TuneDig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to TuneDig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Stop me if you've heard this one before. Band of weirdos who pseudo live and record in a castle, lose their singer, see a dude busking on the street, invite him to come perform with them. He comes up on stage that night, sings, air quotes, a bunch of unintelligible stuff and goes into a screaming fury. Voila, he's in the band.
Is that what rushing for a fraternity is like?
In Germany. There are almost too many good places to enter the inner space of Can, of this remarkable collective that was too weird to live, and over the years has become one of my favorite things ever, just because they're so idiosyncratic and there's still nothing like them to this day, and almost everything that you would say to try to describe them sounds like a random word generator of ideas. Like when you use autocomplete to write a story with text, Can is sort of that as a band. And I'm really excited to kick the season off by getting super weird and getting into their headspace, because there's a lot to learn from it.
Well, we're going to have to break down that headspace in order for you to learn a lot from it, because God help everyone who came up with all of the decisions on this record that actually created something pretty amazing. But wow, when you break the pieces apart and talk about how this actually happened, the fact that they picked up their vocalist on the street, as you've mentioned, and let him join the band immediately is probably not the weirdest thing going on this record, which is sort of what makes it so worth listening to.
So an important foundational element is that everyone in this group is an excellent and classically trained musician of some kind. And they use the phrase intuitive music to describe themselves rather than the genre descriptor that got applied to them based on where they were based. Music did a racism in describing their sound.
Hold on real fast. Let's just talk about this real fast, just so we can stop the perpetuation of this term, because it's like in Wikipedia. So if we get like 5 people less saying this bullshit, it's worth it. Okay, listen. Krautrock was a thing made up by British journalists because they were uncreative and unwilling to write their own articles using, words that adults come up with. So they basically used a racial slur and put them together so that Krautrock basically just means rock played by Germans. Yeah. So let's just put that term to rest. Okay?
You're right. It basically just does mean weird.
Yeah.
It's like art. Anyway, let's get back to Can, music makers of their own design from Germany. So a couple of the guys, including keyboardist Ermin Schmidt, who in a lot of ways was the spirit of this band. A couple of these dudes studied with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who, if you read this incredible book that Ermin Schmidt co-authored called All Gates Open, that is a tome. I mean, it's like 1,000 pages. It's an enormous book. And when I got it in the post, I was not anticipating how large a book it was going to be. But it covers pretty extensively the lead up to how all these cats came together. So you have Ermin Schmidt, who came from the Stockhausen tradition, and Stockhausen was a famous but notoriously rigid band leader, composer, instructor, that type of person who rooted a couple of these guys in classical traditions. Then you have Jackie Leibowitz, who I know we're going to spend some time talking about, the drummer who came up in the jazz tradition, and ultimately in free jazz included, but ultimately found free jazz too limiting, which is an amazing and wonderful contradiction in terms. The long and short of it is that you have all of these people making music at the highest possible level all over Germany and Europe, and ultimately seeking to unlearn. So as the story goes, Ermin Schmidt goes to New York in 1966 and sees a counterculture happening there and the confluence of different mediums of art, and specifically sees Warhol's Outer and Inner Space short film. And the name Can is originally derived from the Campbell Soup series, right? So with Warhol deconstructing art, and then all of these people deconstructing form in music in New York, like Terry Riley and Steve Reich. You have these really interesting things happening across the pond from them that then go on to inspire these conversations about like, what is the antithesis of everything musical, where we can hold on to just the good parts of making music that we love and destroy everything else about it. So you have a simple process of unlearning that leads to this sort of like revolutionary collective of artists.
And what do you want to do when you want to deconstruct the essence of something that's been built up? Or what do you do when you want to deconstruct where something has ended up and go back to the essence? Like, to me, this helped me really understand Can, and is the reason I want to just go ahead and start off by saying, don't write off this music or this band as being pure chaos, or even, you mentioned them operating at their highest form earlier. I just want to convey there's no reason to think that this album was made just by the madness of drugs. This is meticulously constructed, even if it does not align with what usually sounds meticulous to you. And so, like, so much of what blows my mind about Can was the way that, just like you said, kind of breaking something back down to try to get to that essence, keep the parts of music that we like. So much of what was created on Tago Mago was, let's play until we feel right. And let's just once we have the feeling right, literally, keep it going. And let's just keep that going as long as we feel like we're in the right place. We'll sort out making this into a consumable format, literally, later. Like, we're just going to keep going. That creates a tremendous contrast between them and practically anyone else making what you could even qualify as music at that time, and even begins to stretch the boundaries of what we should consider musical to begin with.
Yeah. Their goal, their North Star, is to break onto the other side by force. So they came from this like deep, rich tradition of German and European music scholars, like trying to really figure out the purpose of music, what it's for and where it's headed. So there's this essay that gets referenced in the book from 1928. Robert Bayer, who was one of three people in sort of a school of electronic music thought in Germany, who wrote in this essay, "What more can a composer do than to create musical worlds which do not merely mirror the human world as it is today, but which offer visions or intimations of better worlds?" And you made that point about like, will we want to get toward a good performance? They talked about group meld. And specifically, there's this great quote that I can't remember if it was Ehrman or if it was Holger Tuzé, the bassist, said, "Our communication is not intellectual. Our communication is a spiritual communication that happens while we play. We don't hear what the other plays. We listen to ourselves and to what we're doing. And if we're good, if it works, everything melts together and we'll make a good performance." So that sort of faith, that blind trust in something on the other side that we can't think our way to, is such a perfect summation of the process of unlearning, that there are so many things about Can that are really Stone Agey and primitive, from the drums to the vocals to everything, which is remarkable when you consider what storied musicians these dudes are. But just like trying to get to the most essential place with everything, like to really the base part of their brain, is an interesting aspiration for high-minded musicians, like high minds taking the low road.
This boils things down so much that I began to question, listening to this record, the nature and the purpose of rhythm to begin with, and how it relates to how we categorize music from things that we think are not music. And where does that drive to keep the rhythm come from, and what does it have to do? And I think it works on so many layers. This record, it's amazing how much at once the rhythm can keep you in something, and then that lack of rhythm almost makes you feel like you've been abandoned in a place that you shouldn't be left alone, only to pick you back up later. And I think, again, there is this layer, and maybe now's the right time to bring it up, right? The way that these songs are divided, the way that we start with some more accessible songs to begin with, and then build into tracks that take entire sides of LPs, right? I mean, by the time you get to Hallelujah, I mean, you're starting to open up and go, oh, this is going to get weird. And like, you have no idea unless you remember, like, unless you've listened to this before, you have no idea how weird it's about to get. But, the trajectory of this whole thing is sort of indistinguishable to me from like a well-documented drug trip where like it slowly builds up and you're making sense of things and things feel kind of happy almost and lighthearted. And then they kind of keep breaking apart and like, oh, now I can see all the pieces dissected, except they keep breaking apart and they keep going further and further apart from one another before eventually at the end of the record, at least in my opinion, ending up with a song aptly named Bring Me Coffee or Tea that sort of like brings us back. But throughout this whole record, and I think we'll touch on it in a couple of places, it reminds me of the human need for something like rhythm, something to remind ourselves that we're still okay, that we haven't been lost in the commotion and the noise, that we're not alone. When you're really in it, you really get this feeling of disassociation and almost fear of like, am I going to be found again, right? Mm-hmm. You got to like open your eyes and look around and make physical contact with the space around you just for a moment.
Like in Knocked Up when he's like, oh, I remember what this chair feels like. I like the way it feels to sit in this chair.
Exactly.
Some of that anchoring. Yeah.
Look at this one. Look at it. It's gold and red and it's kind of shiny thread. Unbelievable. It is beautiful and it feels amazing.
The tall one's gawking at me and the short one's being very droll. I don't like them.
Oh, wow.
It's weird that chairs even exist when you're not sitting on them.
I'm up high. I'm really high up.
But that's a basic tenet of mindfulness, right? Like we make stoner jokes, but the two states of being can't exist without the other, right? Like you can't appreciate the good, the light, the rhythm without the atonality and the sheer terror of not having things you are reminded of that ground you, like grounding objects. And they're really necessary. And when you take the record on the whole, it's very hard to sit with the record for its whole running time because it's an extremely physical record that takes you a bunch of different places, but there's enough of that like James Brown song that never starts and ends thing on it where you can just kind of like be there and take the ride.
I'm so glad you said that because like that to me was the connection point and why I wanted to point out like, yeah, in a way, it aligns with all of your drug stereotypes. But just because it aligns with that stereotype doesn't mean that that's its inherent meaning, that was the way that this record was approached or created or intentionally designed to be at all. Just by looking at it from a mindfulness perspective gives you the same like, oh, it seems like they created this like a meditation session that gets tough, right? I mean, legitimately trying to be quiet in this world for more than a few minutes, your brain is going to end up making some of these insane bomb and dog barking noises and shrieks and whatever else that comes out. Like I'd heard it defined before as like, it feels like the monkeys start shaking the trees in your brain and just like stuff starts falling down and you feel real confused. But yeah, I wanted to kind of come right out and say that part of it because it will do this whole record a tremendous disservice if you look at it as like kind of the ramblings of people loosely associated with reality. These people are in it. They did this on very purpose. And so it's just that their entire approach to how the actual raw material would get created is so different than the way that most musicians approached it that it feels foreign.
I think it's interesting that you made it goes all the way out to bring you back in thing. Holger, their bassist, specifically said that the album was an attempt to achieve a mystery musical world from light to darkness and return, which is super interesting when you consider that originally they were only going to put out the one LP. So like all the super weird stuff gets left off, right? The Ohm song, Omgen, I don't know how they want to pronounce it, but we'll call it Ohm, and Pecking O, and then Bring Me Coffee and Tea were going to be left off until their new manager suggested, like, no, this needs to be a double album. Like, this really needs to be a journey, and you need to put all of this stuff together. So there is sort of the normal half and then sort of the trippy half, but they definitely really need the other.